Hi, I'm Libby Witt from the U.S. Department of Education. I work in the Office of State Support. I am not the state assessment expert. When Deborah was looking for people to be panel moderators, I told her I was only going to do this if she put me on a panel where I would actually understand what people were talking about. So this was where I ended up. Thanks, Deborah. Like I said, I work in the Office of State Support. I'm an acting group leader for one of the state groups in the office, and I'm also the program officer for 3 states, including for Florida, which is one of our people is from there. So Vince and I have talked on the phone multiple times. But I do want to just introduce our panelists. This is for those, just to make sure you're all in the right place. I feel like a little bit like a flight attendant here, but this is one of the sessions on best practices in putting together a state assessment peer review submission. There will be another session on this tomorrow afternoon with a different set of panelists. So if you're really interested in this, you could come twice and you might hear totally different things tomorrow. But our panelists today, we have Lou Fabrizio here. Some of you probably can't see him because he's kind of sitting behind the thing. But you'll be able to see him beautifully when this goes on television or on the computer. Lou currently serves as the CEO for Fabrizio Education Consulting, which is his, we were just discussing this, his flunking retirement job. He just recently retired 6 months ago from the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. And when he was at North Carolina, he was the federal policy director and served as the point person for the state's Every Student Succeeds application, state plan, and has worked on assessments at the State Department. Sitting next to him is Sharon Hall. Sharon has worked at the federal, state, and district level. Most recently, she was director of summative assessment systems for the National Center and State Collaborative General Supervision Enhancement Grant. She is also, where I know her from, a longtime member of the U.S. Department of Education, where she worked on assessment and accountability issues. Sitting next to her is Vince Vergis, who is the assessment person, the assistant deputy commissioner, sorry, I have to get all the title bits in there, at the Florida Department of Education, where he oversees Florida's K-12 and post-secondary assessment systems. And then on the end, we have Tammy Howard, who is the director of accountability services at the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. She and Lou were just saying that now Lou's been gone for 6 months, so he can talk to her now. So they're all happy about this. But Tammy works on development and administration of North Carolina's statewide assessment program. All right. I'm going to sit down now because you guys don't need to see me and keep not from blocking this. We know the layout of the room isn't ideal, and some of you probably can't see through this thing, but the main thing is to make sure that everybody can hear. The point of this session is to talk about best practices in putting together the submissions that states submit to the U.S. Department of Education for assessment peer review. So I thought it might be helpful. How many of you in the room are the person at your state agency who's responsible for putting the package together for peer review? Okay. How many of you are new enough in your job where you haven't actually done this? A couple of you. How many of you have done it once? How many of you have done it more than once? Okay, so we do have a couple of experts here. That's good to know. All right. When we were getting the panels together a week or so ago to do some just planning for what we wanted to do, the panelists for both this panel and the one tomorrow were in agreement that there were sort of 2 basic things that we wanted to address in these sessions. The first being, what should states consider in putting together their application package? And the second being, what did these folks as peer reviewers kind of wish states had done in their packages? We've got a table full of really experienced peer reviewers here, but also, in addition, a couple of these folks are the people at their agencies who are responsible for putting together assessment peer review packages. So I'd like to start with Vince and Tammy. What have you learned that would be helpful to you in putting together your state's packages from being a peer reviewer? Vince?
No, I'm going to defer ladies first, and Tammy is one of those few states that has at least one assessment that's met all requirements. So I'm dying to hear what Tammy did in North Carolina to meet requirements.
Well, thank you, Vince, and that's very kind. And we are very excited in North Carolina to have assessments that meets. It was a great deal of hard work, but I think it was also another learning opportunity. And part of the discussion this morning, has been about the requirements. What we're trying to do in North Carolina now, based on experience and previously having submitted peer review now, in my experience, twice, is we're already starting the month of July. We pulled together our team that will be involved with this, and we took the sections 2 at a time. We got around a table, we went through it, we talked about the words, because to me, the most challenging part about peer review is the words. And I know Deborah said this morning that she was being very specific in reading what the words say, because when we read those words, sometimes we can go in the wrong direction for what they actually mean. And so as we're gathered around our table, we're trying to get a common understanding that is consistent with the expectations of the process. So when we gather our evidence, we gather the exact evidence that is needed, that we're answering the question. And that may seem easy to do, but it's not really. It's very, very, very challenging. And particularly when we have new staff in the department, we have turnover, we have folks that have never been involved with peer review before. They don't know what peer review means. And so we're trying to do that old adage of putting where we want to go in the end, but put it at the beginning and kind of work backwards and make sure that we have a clear understanding right now. Because in all honesty, what typically happens in our state, and I don't know if it happens in yours, Vince, but typically what happens is we get the final notification of the date to pull it all together, and then we start scrambling. And we start running, and then we start looking and trying to determine if we actually have something to submit as evidence. And we're trying to kind of back map and not let that happen ever again in North Carolina. So we're trying to turn it around to an ongoing process. So it's part of, as you're developing your assessment, you're pulling it all together, making sure you have the documentation, making sure you're approaching it from that end point in mind, because that's really what it's all about. And I think Don Peasley mentioned that as well this morning, that the whole purpose is to document the process so at the end we have technically sound assessments. So the biggest takeaway I would say is to be prepared on the front end, so at the end it's a matter of just pulling it together and submitting it. And hopefully we'll do a much better job this time than we've done in the past.
Still want to get back to what it is that you think got you over the hump for meeting expectations, but we have quite a bit of time here. I'm going to start off with some of just 3 of the big things, and some of them will be recurring themes. We did start, once we saw the timeline, we had an entire team that went very methodically to go through all the things we thought might help. And so that's the first thing. Not only as a peer reviewer have I been the victim of folks not doing the best job, I've also been a perpetrator. Because we had so much time, we were trying to think about all the things that we would need to do to meet requirements. We submitted a lot. At the time, I thought it was the right amount, 12,000 pages worth of evidence, which is all. We love our assessment system. We love it. And so we thought everything had a place and a reason, and we thought that maybe there's something in there that a peer reviewer might want to see. And then by the responses we got back, we were like, what is this? So I think part of that also, even if you have the right amount of information, we also relied on, I figured we got expert peer reviewers, they'll know what this stuff is. I think one thing I would caution is good explanations, using the words, the right words, and then explaining, here's this thing, here's what it shows, and here's why I think this helps us meet the peer review requirements. That we put in the right column, the right-hand column, and I think we can do a better job in some of the things where substantially meets and everything, and we hope to one day be like North Carolina and meet expectations everywhere. So I think, and then the other thing kind of along those lines, we saw, again, we're going to be into our third resubmission. We were asked for this thing, and we submitted this thing, and then the question was, well, what did you do with this thing? And then, so we want to see some more evidence of explanations or more reason why you did this. And here's why we did this. And, well, you got this information back from your review of the districts. What did you do with that information, like test irregularities, and how does that show that you are, doing oversight and doing your due diligence, down to the end? And I think if you think about, if you can give as much explanation about the process from end to end, if you have it at the time of submission, or if you're not going to have this information, like we reported these schools, if you don't say, well, what did the schools or districts do with that report, you could say, by the spring of blah, 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 we will have resolved this issue with the school. So don't throw the kitchen sink in unless you think you absolutely need it. Have thorough explanations about the evidence, and be thorough about the end-to-end process of any particular strand that you've addressed in your peer review process. So that's my 3 pieces.
Okay, building on that, and Sharon, maybe you can address this. And this is building on the point that Vince made about how much to submit. Is there, when you're a peer reviewer, how much is enough explanation and how much is too much?
I'm going to steal the words Lou used, answer the question. Okay, so that seems so basic, but when you look at the critical elements, there's a listing of subcomponents, components of the critical element. They're bulleted in the index. Do you all have copies of the index? You have that. Why don't you pull that out if you want. You see the bullets. To me, the best thing to do for compiling it, because it helps you know that you've in fact answered the question, and it helps the peers know that you've answered the question, is right next to each bullet, each subcomponent, in that middle column, write a header of what evidence you're putting underneath it. So the example I came up with, I think, was 2.1. It asked about the purpose of the assessment. It asked about the test blueprints, and then cite the evidence, and then it says a header for processes to ensure. Do you see those 3 components under 2.3? Or 2.1 exactly, excuse me. 2.1, there are 3 bullets underneath it. So again, in this middle column, don't just put everything about the assessment or test design. Break it out just as those sub-bullets did. So a header for purpose, cite the document. You're going to label every document you use. Put the page numbers. That's all you have to say. You don't have to write an essay about it. Then the next bullet, the middle column, put a header that says test blueprints, and then cite the documentation you're going to use, what page numbers you have on it. And then the third part was processes to ensure, on and on and on. In the middle column, what you're submitting, write that header in to illustrate the bullet in the first column. Then include the document that has the evidence, and then the page numbers. Then that's enough.
Is there anything, Lou, that you would want to add to that, or particular points building on anything that Tammy and Vince said that you think is particularly important about what states ought to consider in putting this together?
I'm going to stand up since it's really hard for me to talk looking through this podium here. I'm a firm believer in the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. So when you're putting this information together, make it as organized as possible. Make it so that you would feel comfortable being the peer reviewer getting this information. So it's really more a way of taking everything that they've just said and using it effectively. So you don't want the kitchen sink. You do want to make sure that you are giving those page numbers. Do not, under any circumstances, put 10 copies of your technical manual as evidence. You put it one time, and you can label it technical manual, a technical report, and then to do what Sharon was saying, for the different areas where you make reference to that document, it's that same document, but you're just now referencing different pages. That's what has made peer reviewers in the past go crazy, is when a state decides to have one document, but they reference it 20 times or 10 times, and they send it separately as 10 documents when it's just the same document. And so come up with a numbering system. Make sure you use that index effectively. Make it easy for the peer reviewers. If you're going to use acronyms, have a sheet of paper that says, here's what all the acronyms are and what they mean, because it's very frustrating, again, when some acronym gets used and it's never defined in the state's materials. So again, use the golden rule, be organized, put yourself in the position of the peer reviewers, and answer the darn questions.
Can we add even more? Or
Sure,
add
go ahead.
more? Okay.
Go ahead, Sharon.
All right. Well,
And another thing.
and another thought. Often, states submit several assessments at the same time. Okay, so you might have the academic content standard assessment as well as the alternate assessment, alternate achievement standards. So when you do that, be sure that when you're responding, it can all be in the same index, but in the middle column, be sure you indicate what assessment you're referring to. So you could do that in a couple ways. Merely, again, in the header in the second column, saying academic content standard assessment, whatever you're calling that, or the alternate assessment. The other way to do it is color code in the second column. So it's real clear that, green is the state content standard and red is the alternate, something like that. Or use a different, italics or, just non-italics text. But that really helps the peers rather than dumping all the evidence for all the tests. Sometimes there are 3, 4 assessments in one submission on one index. And to just dump all that in the second column, thinking that the peers can unravel that, is aspirational for the peers. You want the peers to find it. Okay, you are the Sherpa for the guidance. You want the peers to find the evidence. So make it clear where the evidence is, and we'll look for it. But if you just say technical report, we can't read the whole technical report to find a very small piece. Some of us will take a crack at it, right? and then sometimes, typically on a peer review, a peer might be assigned 2 and maybe 3 states to do a peer review on. So you still only have 2 weeks ahead of time, and 2 weeks to do 3 assessments is considerable.
Something that came up a couple of times in the planning call was this idea of the person who's submitting the materials for assessment peer review is somebody who knows his or her own state assessment system really well. And there is, I think, a tendency to assume that other people also know your assessment system well, which is, of course, not always an accurate assumption. As a peer reviewer, how much of sort of like an overview or explanation about the state system is helpful to you as part of that? And where's the best place to put that? Should that be something that's in the index, or should there be some sort of other document that just sort of explains how much of that do you want to know about the overall, and if, say, a state is submitting only one assessment, where does this assessment fit into the larger state system? Any of it, Vince?
And I grabbed it because actually it was one thing I want to touch on. Part of my assumption, again, we did our first submission before I was a peer reviewer. Before, I think had I been a peer reviewer first, our first submission might have been better. But I thought it was really good. I'll go back to the process first of all. I've been on 3 different peer review panels, and the panelists are fantastic, or present company excluded. The folks I've worked with have been great and very thorough, professional, diligent, smart, experienced. I really, my hat's off to the selection process. I worked with some great folks. That said, I work with a state that had a very unique situation. I'm not going to mention the state. I'm trying to give any information that I just happened as an assessment director to know the situation they were in. And there are some things that were laid out that weren't really clear from the submission what the state situation, and the peers that were with me said, I have no idea why on earth anybody would do that. And I said, I know exactly why, and as an assessment director, this is what I would have done, and this is what you see. So that really helped. That brings to me, I don't think we have a place in the peer review that allows, other than maybe the cover letter or maybe the first section of the index, somewhere where you're yelling to the peer reviewers, hey, listen, we have a really unique situation. We've just left the consortium after we were in the consortium 1 year, and we had to emergency procure a test, and this is, so we did this stuff. So not everything, not the kitchen sink there, but enough to give somebody who knows assessment but isn't familiar with your state information on how you got to be in this position. So I think, that's really helpful. I'd like to respond, well, Lou, I'll let you respond to that because we have time.
Okay, I was just going to add a little bit more to what you just said. It's important that you submit the evidence for the peer reviewers that they can see without necessarily having to go to a URL. I know this is an issue, and I know Deborah's here. The guidance basically says don't use URLs as your basis for evidence, but I've seen it happen where there's evidence that's submitted, which you can read. It's a document number, and it's helpful. And then states might say, for additional information, you can look at this website. That's fine, but that's not technically what the peer reviewers need to be doing. I've also seen that same thing with videos. And I've seen some videos where I've said, wow, I wish I had read that in one of the documents. It's getting back to that little summary of how the state got to be where they are and all of that kind of stuff. So I think those things are helpful, but you really need to make sure that the URL, if you do submit one, is just for additional information. If you do submit a video, if it's there for a specific reason, then give a time frame. So you could say go to the 42 minutes to see more information about X, and that would be helpful. Oh, you go, Vince.
All right, Tammy?
So, with respect to giving the context of the state, there are situations, and I think they mentioned it this morning as well, that are very unique to your state that sometimes you can't do anything about. It was a decision from the General Assembly, it was a decision from your state board, it was a decision from your leadership, and so you have to kind of navigate and fit those two pieces together. So you provide the evidence, but then I think that's where that notes column comes into place. But I do recall a peer review submission that I was involved in that I think we put way too many notes in that column. It's not necessary to explain everything, but explain very well those things that need to be explained. But I think it goes back to answering the question again, keeping that response very specific and making sure every word counts. One of the other things that we do is we're very fortunate in North Carolina because we are, of course, developing our own assessments, and so we have a lot of resources in our department and also with our partnership with North Carolina State University. So we run our entire submission through our editors. So our editors are looking to make sure that we are saying exactly what we mean in the fewest words possible. And they're also looking to make sure that we're calling something the same thing throughout the submission. In early submissions several years ago, we had a difficulty with that. And it was not the cleanest approach, which can be very frustrating for the peer reviewers because they don't know what we call certain things. And so when we call it A one time and B the next time, then they get kind of lost. But now we run everything through our editors, and they make sure that we do not do that. So if you have availability of editors, we would strongly recommend it. And akin to that, one thing that we would like to do going forward is we would like to do our timeline. So perhaps we can contract with an external reviewer that can go through our submission for particularly the sections around technical quality. I don't know about you guys, but those are the sections that I think we struggle with the most is, the whole issue of validity and what is validity, what is good validity evidence. We're not always in a position of where we can actually generate all of that evidence, sometimes partly due to timing, sometimes partly due to resources or how one would do that in a state assessment program. So we just feel like it's very important to pay attention to those words and do it from a very methodical perspective. So we would appreciate being able to have like an external reviewer. We're going to try to do that this time and see if it goes better.
Okay, so just to recap quickly, one thing that I think all of the panelists want to emphasize is the importance of making clear the organization of your submission. Making sure that things are labeled, making sure that the reviewers know where in the 300-page technical manual you want them to look, because they're going to try and find it. But if you haven't given them the page numbers, the odds of them finding it are greatly reduced. And I want to go back, though, to an issue that we raised a minute ago, this idea of how much is too much explanation and how much is not enough. While I haven't been a peer reviewer, I have been a panel moderator for peer reviews, and listening to peer reviewers discuss, one thing that seems to be a particular issue is a lot of times a big chunk of a state submission is technical documents that came from a vendor. And it's not always, what's the best way for the state to use those highly technical documents? And what is it as a reviewer that you're wanting the state to say about those technical documents that'll help you in determining whether the state has met a critical element or not? What are you looking for in the submission, aside from the actual technical document itself, but what are you looking for states to do with those things? Vince?
And I'll kind of think of this one example. I had this, the state did its due diligence and had a external review of the alignment. I think there were some places in there that I think even an assessment director would see that there's a hole there. And I think it's your responsibility, although I think ultimately our contractors need to help us with those things. So they should give us something that in our mind is 99% of the way there. It's our job to make any explanations as far as what this means and how does it meet the requirement. However, if there's a hole that it's glaring, you've got to say, we know we need some extra work here. You can call that out, put yourself on report, even though you shouldn't do that, but you can acknowledge that we realize we need to do this other thing later. So I think the state needs to make sure it's clear to the contractor up front that they understand what they're expected to submit. And then once the contractor gives it to you, that you review it and make sure that it meets their criteria as well.
So I think related to that is, what do you do when you don't have a piece of evidence? And perhaps it is something that the vendor should have done, or in our case, it would be something that we should have done. And the best approach there over the years, I think, is to provide a plan on what you intend to do. To acknowledge up front, we don't have this piece, but this is what we're doing to move toward that direction. Because sometimes when we try to cover it up and make it sound like we have it and we really don't have it, then I think that's frustrating for the reviewers as well, because they can see through that very, very, very clearly. So at the outset, just go ahead and say, we don't have that piece, but here's what we're going to do to provide that. Because that will be the outcome from the initial review that will then be required in the resubmission. So why not just go ahead and get in on the front end of it and just say up front, we don't have this, but we'll work on it, whether it's with yourselves or with your vendor, either one.
And building on this, some of the panels that I've served on as a monitor, where one of the things that the state submitted as evidence was data runs that the vendor had done. There's a lot of information there. Do you want to see that level of information in an assessment peer review? Is that necessary? And if the data's there, is there anything else you want to see to go along with it? How useful is that?
As far as like correlations, yeah. So as long as if it says you've got correlations like among reporting categories or even across content areas, yeah, we did ask for that. So and then sometimes I think some reviews we got data without a clear explanation of what this was supposed to represent or didn't meet it. So yes, data. Please explain.
Yes, and I was hoping that I was hoping someone would say that. Have heard this, well, I know how I would view this data, but I'm not sure how this state views this data. And so that explanatory piece is an important one. Getting though I want to go back to something that Tammy said earlier. And this is about making sure that you as the state understand what the critical element is asking for. and then looking to be sure that you've included the evidence that ensures that it's clear that you've met that critical element. What are some, and this I think is lopping over into kind of our second general question of what do you wish states had done? What are ways that in your experience as reviewers that you can see that states can demonstrate that they understand what the critical elements are and to demonstrate that the evidence that they've provided actually meets the critical element? What kind of stuff are you looking for?
Answer the question.
Yeah, can you, what kind of evidence, what kind of background are you looking for? What kind of things are you looking for? And when are you concerned that that's not happening?
That's somewhat of a hard question to answer. But usually, for a lot of this information, there are going to be data analyses that usually will have some type of a summary. So you want to focus on the summary. We can look through. There's usually always some psychometrician that's on most of the panels, and the psychometrician, really salivates when they see all of the numbers everywhere and all of that kind of stuff. But it's really the summary that I think is more important. And that's what most peer reviewers are going to want to see. So if you are looking for information to give, if it's a report, there should be a summary of the findings of the specific report. And that gets back to what Vince was saying earlier and Tammy was saying as well, and that is, if there are some things that are oversights, then you might as well point them out. And because as a peer reviewer, if you look at the report, like an alignment study, and then you see that, wow, it's really not aligned very well in this particular grade level, the state needs to be acknowledging that they understand that that is there and here's what we're going to do to fix it. So I think that's really the key. Again, I can't say it often enough. Put yourself in the position of being the recipient of this information and then ask yourself, would you feel comfortable getting this as the response to the specific question? And I think it's great that North Carolina has editors that can help isolate and identify where the gaps might be in that type process. But both Vince and Tammy, both being current state assessment directors, have talked about you have to start this work early. You cannot say, oh, this isn't until spring of 2019, and think that you're going to be able to pull it together in a month. So it can't be overstressed enough how you've got to really start the work now. And for many of you, probably 6 months ago.
And I think that's a good comment, Lou. And I would just add to that in looking at peer review submissions, sometimes it's very clear when the answer is not really available because the same evidence will start popping up again and again. And so there's this repeat factor going on of, well, I put this here, so I'm just going to put it again, and it doesn't really fit. And so the whole submission just starts kind of falling apart because, not to personify, but it's like the submission doesn't have strong character. The submission doesn't have, it's not cohesive. It doesn't flow through the entire process. And so those gaps are really available to someone who's looking at it. And in North Carolina, I don't know about my colleagues, but I would say that we're always kind of aware of where our gaps are. And we do the best effort we can, but it's always interesting, to get back the feedback and see if indeed, it was not acknowledged that was a gap. And I would say it's pretty close, that we're not surprised. It's that whole adage of, were you really surprised? Well, no, we were not really surprised. And then the key thing, I think, is to learn from those surprises. So next round, the good thing about the 2016, 17, 18 round is we've all been through this recently. And so now as we anticipate going through it again, with the ELP assessment. In North Carolina, we're designing new math assessments this year. So we're coming off a very quick turnaround of having this experience. And We do not have quite the turnover we've had in the past. When we have 4 and 5 year gaps between having to submit, then I think it's more of a heavy lift to go back into that mindset. But that just, just to stress one more time, that really peer review should be integrated in the process of developing assessments. So that first meeting with a vendor, and it goes back to the RFP, it should be, how do you support peer review? Where's your technical manual? What is the timeline for it? How are you going to help us demonstrate that we have validity, that we have reliability? What type of data is going to be available? Those kind of questions on the front end with the vendor, if you have that relationship, I would think would be very, very helpful.
Well, and I think this morning, one of the questions that was asked this morning was, who was here from the vendors at this meeting? A lot of them are here. These are the people that most states are going to be working with. They have access to the reviewer guidance just like you do. They're aware of those same critical elements that you need to meet. And so the importance of putting that as part of your assessment planning is a really important one. Sharon, are there any other issues that you would want to raise around what you would like to see states do to demonstrate that they know what the that they understand the critical elements?
Well, I just knocked everyone over. Okay, yeah, thank you. I guess be sure that the staff who's compiling the evidence understands what the critical element is. I think Tammy and both Tammy and Vince gave good ideas about how to do that, start ahead and so forth. But I'll give you an example of what that means. I reviewed a submission that for Section 6, which is academic achievement standards, the state submitted evidence about state content standards, which would be Section 1, critical element 1. You understand the difference, okay? So, someone who's not really attuned to the vocabulary, the terminology, the intention of an assessment, that might be, a novice mistake. So certainly someone has to read behind before the assessment, the submission is submitted. That's just a quick example.
Yeah, I'd build on that with also cognitive processes, which I'm glad we have a whole session on that. Cognitive processes being separate from cognitive complexity, and so there's interrelation there. But I think that's a really tough one. Again, I'm glad there's a session there, which then also leads into the special studies, device comparability studies, COG labs. I think you've got to really look at the evidence where if you didn't do a COG lab, what else is there? There are some ways to meet it. We haven't found them yet, but can you do it without COG labs? And then device comparability. There's meta-analyses out there that talk about device comparability. Is that going to be sufficient for you? So I think knowing what each section means, and then looking through the ways that you might or might not satisfy it is something important. It's something to attend to.
Quick adding, please use that middle column of your index that the department gave you. It gives you very good examples of evidence you can use to submit. So I would certainly start there before I add anything else, anything that's beyond that. If you haven't been able to answer the question using those suggested examples of evidence, then you need to add to it. But if you don't, stop there.
And I think, as Dawn said this morning, the department is in the beginning of the process of posting the peer review comments along with the letters from the original ones, and that may be helpful to some of you in being able to look at some of those peer review comments to see what kinds of questions the peer reviewers are raising, what kinds of things are they looking for that maybe they're not seeing. And that may give you some ideas about ways to meet particular critical elements or what kinds of things peer reviewers are looking for. And so I would strongly urge, particularly if you've never done this, looking at peer reviewer comments from a previous review can be really helpful. Do you have any suggestions for states about where, if they have questions about, what goes in 1.1, what goes in 1, what goes in 6, how they might where should they go to get this information? What are good sources of information, or what kind of things would you recommend as ways of finding out if you're putting together one of these submissions and you're not sure you understand what the critical element is, or you're not sure you understand what kind of evidence the department and the peer reviewers are looking for? Where would you suggest that states go to get that kind of information?
We do two things. One, sometimes we do email the U.S. Department of Education and ask, but we also look at other state submissions. So that's really nice that it's public, so we can go back, and so we'll say, how did so-and-so, where's the state that did this element particularly well? What did they submit? So we spend some time going and looking at those, and so that's very helpful.
I would agree. If you're new to it, you may not have developed that circle of good friends, but I think you can, if you don't know state assessment directors well, I think, again, having the peer review notes from others, you can also not only see the notes, but you can see what they submitted without even calling the state. Another resource is CCSSO. Scott Norton is very good about, he can collect those kinds of information. If you have a specific question, you can talk to Scott Norton at CCSSO, and they can send something out and, have folks respond to you.
The only other thing that I would add is many of you in your states have technical advisory committees, and when you, through some report or analysis that you've done, you find something that's a little quirky or you're not sure exactly what to do with it, that's where you really should be asking advice from your technical advisory committee. And I've seen some states that have, on occasion, submitted minutes from a technical advisory committee where they've said, this was an issue from this analysis or this report. We presented it to our technical advisory committee. They recommended X, and that's what we're doing. And then the documentation would be minutes from a technical advisory committee.
That's what I was going to say.
Oh,
Yeah.
sorry.
No, you just said it much more eloquently.
And your vendor. That was another thing that was mentioned in the planning calls we had is, if you're using a vendor and there's something in the stuff that the vendor has submitted to you that you don't understand, the vendor is part of of your system. We have about a little over half an hour left, and I'd like to give people as much time as possible to ask questions, but I do want to give the panelists, if there's one thing you want to say that you want states to hear, give everybody a chance, and then we'll take questions.
Okay, one of the things that I did want to point out is for things like when were your content standards adopted by your state, and some states will then send the agenda for that item at a board meeting, but then they don't send the minutes that indicate that the board approved it. And so that's something to keep in mind.
Okay, I'm going to reiterate what several people have said and dig a little deeper, and that is give yourself ample time to develop the submission. You can't do it over a weekend. And if you can, let everyone else know how you did it. But I've never seen that. I've had to develop one for a consortium, and it took months to do. It took literally months. And you have to work across divisions and staff to be able to do it well. Give yourself time and have it reread and edited, prior to submitting. Be sure that you're answering the critical elements. There are 33 critical elements, and each one has multiple subcomponents. So that might be over 100 minimum pieces of evidence as you're providing. So you need time to do that well, orderly, in an organized way.
Yeah, this is easier. We should have been doing this the whole time. So, but, I want to reiterate something that Sharon said early on, and I think my general thing is organization, clear and concise and organized. If you have separate contracts, for example, we have one contractor for science and social study, or science. USDV doesn't care about our social studies, thankfully. And then one for ELA and math is to separate them and make sure somewhere that you let the peer reviewers know which contractor is doing what for you. I think that'll be helpful for them. And then back to Lou's earlier point about no links. Each of the panels I've been on, We've done some digging on our own to try to find something to help the state. I don't know if I should even admit that, right? But you know, the peers that I've been part of, we want to help states. We want you to, you know, you're my colleagues, right? I want you to do well. But if you can help yourselves and help peer reviewers by having the evidence there, not relying on links, that'll go a long way towards a good submission.
So I would suggest two things. One is pretty elementary, and that is the submission system, which is max.gov, to don't wait until you're actually ready to upload, to go early on and look and become familiar. Make sure you have your password up to date so you're not panicked at the last moment. And the other thing is to apply to be a peer reviewer. And, you know, I applied a few times before I was finally selected, but I always wanted to be one because I wanted to be able to really, you know, get in the down on the ground level and hear the whole conversation. It was a great experience. I think it helps the state of North Carolina, even though I'm out of the office for a few days. And so I welcome that opportunity, and I encourage you to do that because I think you'll learn a great deal. And I think, as Lou mentioned, the expertise of the other peer reviewers is very impressive, or maybe Vince said it. And so it's an overall very good experience.
Thank you. I would also reiterate what Tammy said about making sure your OMB Max password works. Sometimes people don't think to check it until they try to start uploading documents, and then they find out there's a problem. And as you all know, if you've ever taught or if you've ever, you know, worked on stuff like this, everybody's, you know, the deadline's the same for everybody. 90% of the people are going to wait till the last 2 days to upload everything. And when everybody is trying to upload 150 documents, the system isn't always going to love you back. So, you know, it's good to test your password, start uploading stuff early. We like early. We're not going to review it early, but, you know, you don't have to do it all at the same, you know, data dump where you upload all 120 things at the same time. So the earlier you can get started with that even technical process of it is really helpful. Okay. What we'd like to do now is open it up to questions from state folks. There is a microphone here in the middle. If you can get to it, great. It helps for the videotaping. But if you have to climb over 4 people to get to it, and you have a burning question and you don't feel like you want to do that, that's fine. Just use your teacher voice. Does anybody have any questions for the panel? Oh, a brave person.
Thank you so much. Good to be here. I just, from a couple of different vantage points on this process, it struck me that there are some additional benefits to going through this process that we don't always think about because we're in the situation of scrambling to get our documents together and just complying, just kind of getting the answers to the questions. Especially for Vince and Tammy, are there examples in your experience where this process actually positively affected your decision making or your staff's decision making?
Well, one thing I learned from this is test administration monitoring. I think Florida may be the only state that doesn't do some kind of a desk audit or third-party review of testing. We have a very extensive, we have call logs that we read call logs every single day. We have chat features we monitor every single day. We have all the telemetry data from our computer-based tests. We have a very top-down test administration process. The manuals are 200 and something pages, which we submit initially as our evidence of test administration monitoring. And it turns out when I started talking to the folks, like, you don't do desk audits, you don't do this, you don't have a third party. Nope. And sure enough, that's something I'm kind of curious to know what we're going to find. We're going to implement a test administration monitoring process that looks more like what other states have. So I think that's one place where we're doing something that in the long history of testing in Florida we've never done before. So that was a big change for us, or going to be a big change for us.
So I would agree. I would say over the years our monitoring is getting more and more sophisticated and more across the entire state. We have a system, we have checklists, we know who's doing it, when they're supposed to be doing it, and the feedback for that, I think, is invaluable. From a broader view, though, I would also say that peer review, I think, has supported and helped North Carolina, particularly around standard setting and alignment studies. Alignment studies, first and foremost, as Lou said, and it's very important to remember, we get that information back, so what do you do now? And that is the state's responsibility to look at that and make those decisions and to evaluate that information as to whether or not there does need to be action following that alignment study. With standard setting, knowing that, and North Carolina has a long history with assessments, and I know Lou remembers how we used to set standards, and he would agree that we have come a long way in how we do standard setting in North Carolina. And for those, when we go through standard setting in North Carolina, we consider it a very painful experience. I'm not sure if all of you would agree or not, but we're also trying to work toward this round of standard setting, which we're anticipating in the summer of 2019, to do a more integrated approach with our State Board of Education. So it's not just all of a sudden here we show up with these standards and propose them, and the pushback is very intense. So I think the guidance through peer review and the expectations of that you have evidence, that it's well thought out, that it was a plan, that it was executed with inclusion and with diversity and with stakeholder involvement, all of those pieces support that. And I would also say, just very generally, I do not believe in pointing to someone else or to another entity and saying, well, we have to do this because of X. I don't believe personally in doing that. I do think peer review is excellent in saying to our state board and to our other stakeholders, our General Assembly, our leadership, we have this expectation. This is what it is to have a technically sound assessment system for the children of North Carolina. This is what we have to do. We cannot make that decision because it is going to not meet peer review. So not to cast the stone and, as an excuse, but in the intention of having the best system that we possibly can, which I think is very important.
Anything? All right, any other questions? Nobody wants to air their questions in public.
Maybe Deborah needs to leave the room, and Libby.
Yeah, no, Libby doesn't know what you're talking about anyway, so it's like,
I thought if there weren't questions, there were a few things that people said that
Okay.
I kind of wanted to highlight. This is obviously a subject close to my heart as well. So one thing I heard is work across offices, and I did want to emphasize that, especially if you're in a large state where sometimes we get peer review submissions, but you're not the office that handles special education, for example. Well, there are really key pieces of this that are about special education. A lot of times we find out after the fact that, yes, your state is doing that, but you may not have talked across offices and gotten all the pieces that you needed to. The piece about looking at max.gov in advance, max.gov, we think it's a great, easy system to work with. Takes a little bit to get into it, but once you're in and your password's working and everything, we find it really an easy way to share documents. It's very good at that. It's good at sharing a lot of documents. What it doesn't do that we get asked about is, well, I wanted to organize things under subfolders and things like that. It doesn't do that. So this is where document labeling, I would really emphasize. We've talked a lot about the index, which is super, super helpful, and how you label your documents. It sounds like a small thing, but when there's 150 of them, it's pretty important. I recommend labeling by number, or if you're submitting multiple tests, maybe you have every name starts with a specific test or something like that, something that is easy to sort and find things.
And named logically, right? So not just labeled, but named something.
So, what's your preference, to name it exactly like the document is named, or to abbreviate and make it really simple, technical report? Or do you want the full name that's actually on the cover of the document? Do you know what I mean? So you would do like Exhibit 1 and then some abbreviated version?
So I would suggest, one, have some kind of numbering system, and two, simple but straightforward. So rather, technical report, or technical report and the test name. So it doesn't need to be a full-time.
Yeah, abbreviations are fine. Yeah, you don't, because some of the titles are so long, that would not be helpful.
alignment study. You know,
Yeah, and if you've got more than one technical report, be sure that you differentiate them. It might be useful to take your index and have somebody at your agency who isn't in your office look at it and see if it makes sense to them. Like, could you find stuff using this index? Because if it doesn't make sense to a reasonably intelligent person who's not an expert on assessment, it probably there you may have an issue. It's one of those situations, I think, where you know what you're talking about, but you want to be sure that somebody who isn't you knows what you're talking about. So it might be useful to have somebody else in your office who doesn't work on assessment. You know, just have a look at the index, you know, see if they can find things. If the structure of it makes sense, then it's more likely to make sense to the reviewers when they get it.
I wanted to just raise one other common issue that I didn't hear talked about because you all covered technical documents really well. A lot of the documents that are asked for relate to how are you communicating with schools, districts, parents. And so I'm just going to suggest really read the critical element, and if the critical element is about how are you communicating something, a lot of times we get evidence of the something, but not evidence that it was made available to schools or parents. How, you know, so if the critical element, and sections 5 and 6 have a lot of these, if it's about how you're communicating something, that's really a thing that you need to show us, and that can be shown through training documents or letters or things like that, but just make sure that that's part of what you're thinking about. And then I'll let other people ask questions.
Well, this might be getting into the weeds, but I was on that max.gov, so you cannot have folders and subfolders where you're going to place these documents. So does it do all documents? If you have 300 documents, they all just go into a single folder?
a list.
It's a list.
Just a list.
A list. Okay.
Which is why the index is really important.
Yeah, I can see that.
You can also do comments with the evidence when you submit it, and so we would upload it and then say criteria 3.1, 3.2, whatever. I don't know if that was helpful or not, but it was helpful for me to make sure that I was clarifying in an additional spot where all they needed to use this at.
And to label the, for the list, put all the evidence for the particular assessment together. So you're not mixing up the ELP assessment with the alternate assessment with the content standard assessment, academic content assessment, okay? Because then you're bobbling through the list, you know, a header and each specific evidence for a test together.
If they were generally uploaded in order from first critical element to the end, that was about as good as I think we could ask for. And like the technical report, you'd have to jump back to, but you knew where it was early in the list. So first occurrence, just upload them in order if possible, I think is about the best you can do.
By test is what I was hearing.
I preferred, again, this is where I preferred by critical element. So if you submitted your science and social studies, or your science and ELA math tests were from different vendors, I put critical element 1, put all your ELA and math, and then all your science together. If it was in the same submission index, put them together.
And I think Sharon is talking about looking at tests separately, and Vince is talking about looking at critical elements separately. And I think either works as long as you label it so people know what they're looking at. And I think for the items like the technical manual, is it helpful to, on the label, put all the critical elements that it, or just the first one, and then in the index refer back?
It's a lot of critical elements.
Yeah, I mean,
To me, it just what assessment, what the name of the document, test, technical report, and then you find it. You'll know it. You'll have a page number on the index to refer to it. I don't need any more in the listing of documents. I wish we had visuals. That'd be helpful,
Yeah.
wouldn't it? Yeah.
yeah. Well, and even though there is an index template, I mean, I can just say from having been panel monitor for a couple of these, people don't use the index in the same way. Some of them are a lot more detailed and filled out. And some of them do what Sharon was talking about earlier, where they've broken out the sub-elements and made sure that it's clear what document goes with each sub-element. And you have other ones where they just deal with the critical element as a whole, and there's just a whole list of things. I think labeling the sub-elements is really helpful because it helps the peer reviewer know where they're supposed to be looking for that particular thing that you're wanting to point them to. And it seems to me that one of the themes of what people have been saying here, part of it is, part of your job as the state person is to be sure that the peer reviewer knows where to look. When we were doing our planning call, Sharon had a really great thing that she said that I'm going to poach from her, and I'm going to use it tomorrow afternoon too. She says, if the peer reviewer can't find the piece of evidence, even if you submitted it, they cannot recommend that you've met the critical element if they can't find it. And that's where you get the 300-page technical manual, and the one thing you need is on page 75. But you haven't given them the page number, the odds of them getting to page 75 are greatly reduced. And so it becomes a little bit of a toss-up whether they're going to get there or not. So be sure that the reviewers can find the thing you want them to see.
Getting back to that topic of finding the things you want to see, and that's why it's important to have somebody else, you recommended somebody outside of your department double-checking stuff. I've had instances where it'll say go to page 25 when it was supposed to be 52, where they transposed the digits. And so somebody needs to double check to make sure that the direction they're sending you is to the right destination. And spell check, I'm always surprised that it's very apparent that some states don't even run a spell check on their submission, and so you get stuff that has titles that are incorrect or misspelled, and again, it's all things that as reviewers we're like, ooh, they didn't catch that. No, they didn't catch that, and that's when you get the feeling, wow, they must have really just rushed to get this submitted. So everyone, when you go back home, start making sure you got everything scheduled for spring of 2019. Don't wait any longer.